The dust rose in clouds behind the wagon as Penelope Jackson drove into Challis, Idaho, her heart heavier than the iron safe containing nothing but unpaid bills sitting in the back. She had traveled for 3 weeks from Kansas City, her husband dead 6 months now, leaving her with nothing but debts that would take a lifetime to repay, and a false hope that his brother might take her in, only to find upon arrival that he had moved to California 2 years prior, and nobody knew where. The October sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly on her black morning dress, and she could feel the stares of the townspeople as her rickety wagon creaked down Main Street, announcing her poverty with every groan of its worn wheels. She had exactly $4.32 to her name, owed $718 to various creditors back east, and had no prospects, no family, and no plan beyond surviving the next 24 hours. Thomas Rourke stood outside the general store, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden planks of the boardwalk. He had been watching the widow's arrival with the same careful attention he gave to everything in this town, the kind of watchfulness that came from spending 10 years alone after his own wife had died in childbirth along with their son. At 34, he had built a reputation as the most successful rancher in the valley, a man who kept to himself but paid his debts and treated his workers fairly. He owned 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, had 200 head of cattle, and employed 6 ranch hands who respected him but knew better than to ask about the sadness that lived behind his gray eyes. The loneliness had become such a constant companion that he barely noticed it anymore. Or so he told himself every morning when he woke up in an empty house that still smelled faintly of the hope he had once carried for a different life. The wagon came to a stop outside the boarding house, and Thomas watched as the woman climbed down with a grace that her shabby dress could not diminish. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from carrying worry that never sleeps. He saw her shoulders straighten as she approached the boarding house door, saw the way she lifted her chin, despite the whispers that had already started among the townspeople, who had nothing better to do than gossip about strangers. Something in that gesture, that small act of defiance against circumstances that would have broken a weaker person, made him take a step forward before he had consciously decided to move. Penelope knocked on the boarding house door with as much confidence as she could summon, but her hand trembled slightly. The door opened to reveal a stern-faced woman in her 50s, who looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that calculated worth to the penny. "I need a room," Penelope said, keeping her voice steady. "Just for a few nights while I sort out my situation." $2 a night, meals included, the woman said flatly. "Payment in advance." Penelope's heart sank. At that rate, she could afford 2 nights and would have 32 cents left. 2 nights to find employment, find shelter, find some miracle that would keep her from starving or worse. "I can pay for tonight," she said carefully. "I am looking for work and will be able to pay for subsequent nights once I secure employment." The woman's expression did not soften. "This is not a charity establishment. $2 a night, paid in advance, or I cannot accommodate you." "Please," Penelope said, and she hated the desperation that crept into her voice despite her best efforts. "I am a hard worker. I can cook, clean, so keep accounts. I just need a chance to find something." "Every vagrant who comes through here has a similar story," the woman said, already beginning to close the door. "I wish you luck, but I cannot help you." The door shut with a finality that felt like a physical blow. Penelope stood there for a moment, her mind racing through options that did not exist. She could sleep in the wagon, but winter was coming to these mountains and she would freeze within a few weeks. She could try to sell the wagon and horses, but they were barely worth $50 together, and that would leave her stranded. She could write to acquaintances back east, but that would take weeks, and she had already exhausted every connection that might have helped her. The weight of her situation pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe, and for a moment she wanted nothing more than to sit down on the steps and weep until she had no tears left. "Pardon me, madam." The voice was deep and quiet, and Penelope turned to find herself looking up at the tall cowboy who had been watching from across the street. Up close, she could see that his face was weathered but handsome, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting at distant horizons, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and there was something in his gray eyes that was not pity but rather understanding. "I could not help but overhear your conversation. My name is Thomas Rourke, and I own the Double R Ranch about 5 miles outside of town." "Penelope Jackson," she replied, straightening her spine again and meeting his gaze directly. She would not be ashamed of her circumstances, even if they were dire. "I am recently widowed and have come west to start over, though my plans have encountered some unexpected obstacles." Thomas nodded slowly, still turning his hat in his calloused hands. He had not spoken this many words to a woman in years, and he could feel the rust in his social graces, but something about her refused to let him walk away. "I find myself in need of a housekeeper at the ranch. The position would include room and board, plus $30 a month. If you are interested, the job is yours." Penelope's first instinct was to accept immediately, but years of being a merchant's wife had taught her to examine opportunities carefully. "That is extraordinarily generous of you, Mr. Rourke, but I must be honest about my situation before you make such an offer. I am not merely poor. I am in debt to the sum of over $700, owed to creditors in Kansas City. My husband was a good man but a poor businessman, and his ventures failed one after another until there was nothing left but promissory notes and shame. I cannot in good conscience accept employment under false pretenses if there is any chance that my debts might somehow become your burden." The words hung in the air between them, and Penelope watched Thomas's face carefully for the change she expected to see, the withdrawal of the offer, the polite excuse that would leave her back where she had started. Instead, his expression remained steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that she had not heard from anyone in a very long time. "I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Jackson, and it only confirms my belief that you are exactly the kind of person I would want working at the Double R. As for your debts, I cannot see how they would affect me unless you are planning to steal my silverware and run off in the night, which I do not believe you are. You work for me, you earn your wages, and what you do with those wages is your own business. If you choose to send money back east to pay down debts from a life that is behind you, that is admirable but not required. What I need is someone who can keep a house, prepare meals, and perhaps help bring some order to a place that has been run by men alone for too long. The job is yours if you want it, debt and all." Penelope felt something crack open in her chest, some tight knot of fear and despair that had been cinched there for months. This stranger was offering her not just employment but dignity, not just wages but the chance to rebuild something from the ruins of her old life. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall in the middle of Main Street, and her voice was rough when she finally spoke. "Then I accept, Mr. Rourke, and I promise you will not regret giving me this opportunity." "I am certain I will not," Thomas said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was not quite a smile but was perhaps the beginning of one. I have some business to finish in town, but if you would like to wait here, I can have you out to the ranch before supper time. Fair warning, the place is in need of a woman's touch. I have been batching it with my ranch hands for a decade, and our standards of housekeeping would likely horrify you. I assure you, Mr. Rourke, that after 3 weeks on the trail and the morning I have had, very little could horrify me, Penelope said, and she felt the smallest hint of humor creep into her voice for the first time in longer than she could remember. I will wait here with my wagon and try not to cause any more of a spectacle than I already have. Thomas settled his hat back on his head and nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal some unspoken contract between them. I will be an hour at most. There is a cafe just down the street if you are hungry. Tell them to put it on my account. Before Penelope could protest that she still had enough money to buy her own meal, Thomas had turned and walked away with the long, easy stride of a man accustomed to covering distance on foot. She watched him go, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and offered her salvation without asking for anything in return, and she wondered what kind of man did such a thing, and what sorrows had carved those lines into his face. The debt she owed to creditors in Kansas City suddenly felt less crushing than the debt of gratitude she now owed to Thomas Rourke, and she made a silent promise to herself that she would prove worthy of his trust, even if it took the rest of her life. The ride out to the Double R Ranch took them through country that made Penelope catch her breath, despite her exhaustion. The October afternoon had mellowed into evening, and the mountains that ringed the valley glowed gold and purple in the slanting light. Thomas drove her wagon while she sat beside him, and he pointed out landmarks with the economy of words she was beginning to recognize as his natural way of speaking. The ranch, when it came into view, was larger and more prosperous looking than she had expected. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and glass windows that spoke of money spent on comfort rather than just necessity. There were several outbuildings including a large barn, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a smokehouse, and various sheds for equipment and stores. "The house needs work," Thomas said as he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch. "I have kept up with repairs to the structure itself, but the inside is pretty rough. My wife had started to make it into a proper home before she passed, but after that I just could not seem to bring myself to finish what she had started. Seemed disrespectful somehow, though I know that does not make much sense." "It makes perfect sense," Penelope said quietly, understanding flooding through her. This was not just a house that needed a housekeeper. This was a shrine to grief that had been locked in place for a decade, and she was being invited to help dismantle it. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders, but it felt cleaner somehow than the weight of debt she had been carrying. "How long has it been since she passed, if you do not mind my asking?" 10 years this past spring," Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon and coming around to help her down. His hands were strong and steady as he lifted her by the waist, and he set her on the ground with a gentleness that suggested he remembered how to treat a woman even after a decade alone. "She died in childbirth, and the baby with her, a boy. We had planned to name him Matthew after her father." "I am so sorry," Penelope said, and the words felt inadequate but sincere. "My husband died of pneumonia last spring, 6 months and 4 days ago. His name was Robert, and he was kind but foolish with money, and I loved him despite the difficulties that caused. I do not think grief ever really goes away. We just learn to carry it differently." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that was not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Two people who had been broken by loss and were still trying to figure out how to live in the after. "I think you are right about that," he said finally. "Come on, let me show you where you will be staying, and then I will introduce you to the men. They are a good crew, but they have been without proper supervision for a long time and have gotten into some bad habits. Do not be afraid to crack the whip if they get out of line." The inside of the house confirmed everything Thomas had said. The bones of it were good, with solid furniture and craftsmanship evident in the details. But it had the unmistakable air of a place where men lived without any thought to comfort or beauty. Dust coated every surface, dishes were piled in the kitchen, and the floors looked like they had not been properly swept in months. Penelope could see the ghost of what the house had been meant to be in the curtains that hung limply at the windows, now faded and stained, and the china cabinet that held dishes too fine for everyday use, dishes that had probably not been touched since Thomas's wife had placed them there. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the right," Thomas said, carrying her trunk up the stairs with an ease that spoke of hard physical labor shaping his strength. "It was going to be a nursery, but we never got that far in the preparations. I have been using it for storage, but I cleared it out this past week. Seemed like it was time." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley. Someone, she assumed, had made up the bed with fresh linens and placed a vase of wildflowers on the dresser. The gesture was so unexpectedly thoughtful that Penelope felt her throat tighten again. "This past week?" she asked, turning to look at him with confusion. "But you only met me this afternoon. How could you have prepared this room last week?" Thomas set her trunk down and shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "I did not prepare it for you specifically. I prepared it because I put an advertisement in the newspaper 3 weeks ago for a housekeeper, and I thought someone might respond. Nobody did, at least not anyone I felt good about hiring, but the room was ready just in case. When I saw you in town today, it seemed like maybe things happen the way they are supposed to, even if it is not the way we planned them." "You believe in fate, then?" Penelope asked, curious about this man who was turning out to be more complicated than his quiet exterior suggested. "I believe in opportunities," Thomas said carefully. "And I believe in not wasting them when they appear. You needed help, I needed help, and we happened to be in the right place at the right time. Maybe that is fate, or maybe it is just luck, but either way, I am glad you are here." The simple sincerity of his words warmed something in Penelope that had been cold for a very long time. "I am glad to be here," she said honestly. "And I promise you that by this time next week, this house will be transformed. I may bring debt and trouble, but I also bring determination and a strong work ethic. You will not be disappointed, Mr. Rourke." "Thomas," he said, extending his hand for her to shake. "If we are going to be living under the same roof, even if you are the housekeeper and I am the boss, we might as well use first names. Keeps things simpler." "Thomas, then," Penelope agreed, taking his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, and his palm was calloused from years of ranch work. "And you may call me Penelope, though most people end up shortening it to Penny after a while." "Penelope is a good, strong name," Thomas said, releasing her hand. "Seems a shame to shorten it, but I will call you whatever you prefer. Now, let me show you the kitchen and the pantry, and then we will get you introduced to the crew before supper. Fair warning, I told them we would be hiring a housekeeper and that they were to be on their best behavior, but their best behavior is still pretty rough around the edges." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions and information. The 6 ranch hands were a varied group, ranging from a boy of 17 named Billy, who looked at Penelope with wide-eyed terror, to a grizzled cowboy in his 50s named Jack, who had the courtesy to remove his hat and nod respectfully when they were introduced. Thomas made it clear that Penelope was in charge of the house, and that anyone who gave her trouble would answer to him. And the men all nodded agreement with varying degrees of enthusiasm. They ate supper in the bunkhouse that first night, a meal of beans and bacon that the men had prepared themselves, and Penelope made mental notes about supplies she would need to order and routines she would need to establish. By the time she climbed the stairs to her small room that night, she was exhausted in a way that was entirely different from the exhaustion she had felt that morning. That had been the weariness of hopelessness, of having no path forward and no energy to search for one. This was the good tiredness of a day spent working toward something, of having purpose and direction again. She changed into her nightgown and knelt beside the narrow bed, folding her hands the way she had been taught as a child. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "I do not know why you sent Thomas Rourke into my path today, but I am grateful beyond words. Please help me to be worthy of this chance, and please help me to bring some light back into his life the way he has brought hope back into mine. Amen." She climbed into bed and was asleep within minutes, never hearing Thomas as he stood in the hallway outside her door for a long moment, before retreating to his own room at the far end of the hall. He had not mentioned to Penelope that he had barely slept in that room since his wife died, preferring to fall asleep in the chair in his study most nights rather than face the bed, where everything had gone so terribly wrong. Tonight, though, he found himself walking to the bed and sitting on the edge of it, running his hand over the quilt that Mary had made during her pregnancy, stitching her hopes and dreams into every square. "I know this probably seems strange," he said quietly to the empty room. "Bringing another woman into the house after all this time. But I think you would have liked her, Mary. She has your strength, that core of steel underneath the gentleness. And God knows this place needs someone to bring it back to life. I have been a ghost living in a tomb for long enough. Maybe it is time to figure out how to be alive again." The room offered no answer, but Thomas felt something ease in his chest as he stretched out on top of the quilt and closed his eyes. For the first time in 10 years, he fell asleep in his own bed and did not dream of death. The transformation of the Double R ranch house began the next morning and proceeded with a speed that left Thomas somewhat astonished. Penelope rose before dawn, braided her hair into a practical coronet, and attacked the kitchen with the focused intensity of a general planning a military campaign. By the time Thomas came downstairs, she had already scrubbed every surface, organized the pantry, and started breakfast. The smell of coffee, bacon, and fresh biscuits filled the house, and Thomas stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, temporarily stunned by the domesticity of the scene. "Good morning," Penelope said, looking up from where she was stirring a pot of gravy. Her face was flushed from the heat of the stove, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek, and Thomas thought she looked more alive than the haunted woman who had stepped off the wagon yesterday. "I took the liberty of going through your pantry and making a list of supplies you need. Your stores are good for staples, but you are completely out of anything that might be considered a vegetable or fruit. I also need some basic cleaning supplies if I am going to tackle the rest of the house. Is there a budget I should work within, or do you want to review the list before I order anything?" Thomas moved into the kitchen and accepted the cup of coffee she poured for him, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "Order whatever you need. We have accounts at both general stores in town, and I trust your judgment on what is necessary. As for budget, we are fortunate enough to be doing well this year. The cattle prices have been good, and I made some profitable sales last month. Do not worry about the cost of getting the house in order." "I am not extravagant by nature," Penelope assured him, plating up breakfast with practiced efficiency. "But I do believe that a well-run household requires certain basic supplies, and from what I saw last night, you have been making do without them for far too long. Also, I intend to start a kitchen garden in the spring if you do not object. Fresh vegetables would improve the diet for everyone here and save money in the long run." "I do not object," Thomas said, taking the plate she handed him and sitting down at the table that she had already scrubbed clean. Mary had started a garden out behind the house. "It is all grown over now, but the fence posts are still there. You would be welcome to reclaim it if you want." Penelope paused in her work, and Thomas saw her weighing her response carefully. "Would that bother you if I took over something she had started?" The question was gentle but direct, and Thomas appreciated her asking rather than assuming. "No," he said after a moment of consideration. "I think it would make her happy, actually. She would have hated seeing her work go to waste." She was practical that way. "Then I will plan to start preparing the ground before winter sets in," Penelope said, resuming her breakfast preparations. "I will ring the bell for the men in about 10 minutes. I noticed you have a bell on the back porch. I assume that is how you have been calling them to meals." "When we bother to ring it, yes," Thomas said, tasting the gravy and nearly groaning at how much better it was than anything the men had been making. "Most of the time we just eat whenever we get hungry and do not worry too much about set meal times. But I imagine you are going to change that." "I am," Penelope confirmed without apology. "Meals at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. I will keep a pot of coffee on the stove throughout the day for anyone who wants it, and there will be bread and fixings available for anyone who needs something between meals. But proper meal times create structure, and structure creates efficiency. You will find your men work better when they are eating regularly and eating well." Thomas found himself nodding agreement, impressed by her confidence and her clear-sighted approach to the work. She was not here to be timid or to tiptoe around the way things had been done. She was here to do a job, and she was going to do it properly. He had made a good decision yesterday on impulse, and he was grateful that his instincts had proven correct. The days that followed established a new rhythm at the Double R Ranch. Penelope worked from dawn until well after dark, and the house responded to her attention like a flower responds to water and sun. Floors were scrubbed, windows were washed, curtains were taken down and cleaned and rehung or replaced. She ordered supplies with Thomas's approval, and then put them to immediate use. The kitchen became the heart of the house, always warm and smelling of bread or stew or pie. The men began showing up for meals exactly on time, drawn by the promise of good food and the gentle authority with which Penelope ran her domain. Thomas found himself spending more time in the house, inventing excuses to come inside during the day to check on things, or to ask Penelope questions about supplies or schedules. He told himself it was just good management, keeping track of the changes being made to his property, but he knew he was lying. The truth was that the house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt alive again, and he wanted to be part of that life instead of hiding from it. He began eating his meals at the kitchen table instead of taking a plate out to the barn. He started sleeping in his own bed every night instead of falling asleep in his chair. He found himself looking forward to the sound of Penelope singing softly to herself as she worked, or the way she would pause in whatever task she was doing to watch the sunset through the clean windows, her face soft with appreciation for beauty that cost nothing but attention. 3 weeks after Penelope had arrived at the ranch, Thomas came in from checking the north pasture to find her in the study that he used as an office, standing on a chair and stretching to reach the top shelf of the bookcase with a dust cloth. He stopped in the doorway, his heart suddenly pounding, because the study had been the one room he had asked her not to clean. It was his private space, the place where he kept his papers and his memories and his grief, and he had specifically told her to leave it alone. Anger flared hot in his chest, a defensive fury at this invasion of his sanctuary. But before he could speak, Penelope turned and saw him. She climbed down from the chair immediately, the dust cloth still in her hand, and he could see her reading his expression with quick intelligence. "I apologize," she said quietly, her chin lifting in that gesture he had come to recognize as her response to difficulty. "You asked me not to clean this room, and I have disregarded your wishes. That was wrong of me, and I have no excuse except that I saw the dust accumulating and my fingers itched to address it. If you want to dismiss me for overstepping my bounds, I will understand." The apology and the offer to leave deflated his anger like a pin in a balloon. Thomas leaned against the door frame and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in his chest. "I do not want to dismiss you," he said finally, opening his eyes to meet hers. "You have done nothing to deserve dismissal. I am the one who needs to apologize. I am not angry that you cleaned the room. I am angry at myself for being such a coward that I had to forbid you from cleaning it in the first place." Penelope set the dust cloth down on his desk and folded her hands in front of her apron. "You are not a coward, Thomas. You are grieving, and grief makes its own rules about what we can and cannot bear. I should have respected your boundaries instead of assuming I knew better." "Your assuming was probably correct," Thomas said, pushing himself away from the door frame and walking into the room. He looked around at the space that he had kept frozen in time, at the books Mary had loved, at the small daguerreotype of her on his desk, at the baby clothes that were still folded in a drawer that Penelope had not yet opened. "I have been keeping this room as a shrine, and that has not been healthy. It is time to let some air and light in here too, along with the rest of the house." "Are you sure?" Penelope asked, and her voice was gentle with understanding. "There is no rush, Thomas. The room can wait until you are ready." "I am not sure I will ever feel ready," Thomas admitted, sinking into the chair behind his desk. "But I think maybe that means it is time anyway. Mary used to quote this poem to me, something about how courage is not feeling unafraid but acting despite the fear. I do not remember the exact words, but the sentiment stuck with me. So yes, clean the room, Penelope. Just be gentle with the personal items, please. I am not ready to dispose of everything yet." "Of course," Penelope said softly. She picked up the dust cloth again but paused before returning to her work. "May I ask you something personal?" Thomas nodded, curious about what she wanted to know. "You think she would want you to be happy again?" Penelope asked, meeting his eyes directly. "Your wife, I mean. Do you think she would want you to spend the rest of your life frozen in the moment you lost her, or do you think she would want you to find a way to live fully again?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow, not because it was cruel but because it was exactly what he had been avoiding asking himself for 10 years. He sat with it for a long moment, really considering it instead of giving the automatic answer that grief demanded. "She would want me to be happy," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Mary was not a selfish woman. She was full of life and joy, and she would have hated the thought of me turning into this hollow version of myself. She would have kicked my rear end up one side of the valley and down the other for wasting 10 years feeling sorry for myself." "Then maybe it is time to stop wasting time," Penelope said gently. "Not to forget her, but to honor her by living the kind of life she would have wanted for you. A life with joy and purpose and connection to other people. A life that is about more than just going through the motions." "Is that what you are doing?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "Honoring your husband by moving forward instead of staying stuck?" Penelope smiled sadly and shook her head. "I am trying to. Some days are easier than others. But I know Robert would not want me to drown in the debts he left behind or to spend the rest of my life apologizing for his failures. He was a dreamer and a poor businessman, but he loved me, and he would want me to find happiness again. So I am trying to do that, one day at a time, even when it feels impossible. You are a wise woman, Penelope Jackson, Thomas said, feeling something shift in his chest, some ice that had been frozen there for years beginning to crack and melt. And I am grateful every day that I saw you step off that wagon in Challis. You have brought more than just clean floors and good meals to this ranch. You have brought hope, even if I did not realize I had lost it until you gave it back to me. Penelope's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back quickly, turning her attention to the bookshelf to hide her emotion. That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time, she said, her voice not quite steady. Thank you, Thomas. You have given me hope too, and a chance to rebuild my life. That is worth more than any amount of money. They worked together in the study for the rest of the afternoon, Thomas sorting through papers and making decisions about what to keep and what to discard while Penelope cleaned around him. They talked as they worked, sharing stories about their lost spouses and their lives before grief had reshaped them. Thomas learned that Penelope had been married for 6 years, that she had loved her husband despite his faults, that she had always wanted children but it had never happened. Penelope learned that Thomas had grown up on this land, that he had taken over the ranch from his father when he was 22, that he had met Mary at a church social, and had known within 5 minutes that he wanted to marry her. The conversation was easy and natural, without the awkwardness Thomas had expected, and by the time the dinner bell rang, he felt like he understood Penelope in a way that went beyond just employer and employee. That night, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen was clean, Thomas found Penelope standing on the front porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude on her privacy, but she turned and smiled when she heard the door open, and he took that as an invitation to join her. "It is beautiful here," Penelope said, her voice soft in the evening stillness. "I grew up in a city, and I never knew skies could look like this. So many stars you could never count them all." "One of the benefits of being in the middle of nowhere," Thomas said, leaning against the porch railing beside her. "No lights to drown out the stars." Mary used to say that looking at the stars made her feel small but not insignificant, like she was part of something bigger than herself. I never quite understood what she meant until after she was gone, and then I understood it all too well. "I think I know what she meant," Penelope said thoughtfully. "When you look at something that vast and timeless, your own problems seem smaller somehow. Not unimportant, but not all-consuming either. It gives perspective." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his voice careful. "Penelope, I want you to know that the job you are doing here goes far beyond what I hired you to do. You are not just keeping house. You are bringing this place back to life, and I am more grateful for that than I can properly express. I know I am paying you $30 a month, but that does not seem like enough for what you are contributing. I would like to raise your wages to $50 a month, starting immediately." Penelope turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Thomas, that is extraordinarily generous, but it is not necessary. You are already paying me fairly, and you are giving me a home and security. That is worth far more than any amount of money." "Maybe so, but you are worth $50 a month and more besides," Thomas said firmly. "Consider it settled. And there is something else I want to discuss with you. Your debt back in Kansas City. $718, you said. At $50 a month, if you saved every penny, you could pay that off in just over a year." But you cannot save every penny because you need things for yourself. So let us say it would take you 2 years or maybe longer to clear the debt, and during that whole time, you would be carrying the weight of it on your shoulders. I am accustomed to carrying weight, Penelope said quietly, but Thomas could hear the weariness beneath the words. I know you are, but you do not have to carry this particular weight alone, Thomas said, turning to face her fully. I would like to pay off your debt for you, Penelope, all of it in one payment so that you can start fresh without that burden hanging over you. Consider it a loan if that makes it easier to accept. You can pay me back over time or not, as you prefer. But I do not want you spending the next 2 years sending every spare cent back east when you should be building a life here. Penelope stared at him, and he watched emotions flicker across her face too quickly to name. Shock, gratitude, confusion, and something else that he could not quite identify. Thomas, I cannot let you do that, she said finally, her voice shaking. $700 is a fortune. It is more than a year's wages for most people. I cannot possibly accept such generosity from you. It would not be right. Why not? Thomas challenged gently. I have the money, Penelope. The ranch is profitable, and I have been saving for 10 years with nothing to spend it on. $700 will not bankrupt me or even inconvenience me particularly. And it would free you from a burden that you should never have had to carry in the first place. Your husband's poor business decisions are not your fault, and you should not have to pay the price for them for the rest of your life. But it is too much, Penelope protested, and Thomas could see her struggling with pride and practicality. You barely know me. We have only worked together for 3 weeks. How do you know I will not take your money and disappear in the middle of the night? How do you know I am even telling the truth about the debts? Because I am a good judge of character, Thomas said simply. And because I do not believe in making people I care about suffer unnecessarily when I have the power to help them. Let me do this, Penelope. Let me shoulder this debt so that you can carry hope instead. That is all I am asking. The tears that Penelope had been holding back finally spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands. Thomas acted on instinct, pulling her into an embrace that was meant to be comforting, but felt like something more the moment his arms closed around her. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucking under his chin, and he could feel her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as she finally let herself release the fear and stress and exhaustion she had been carrying for months. He held her while she cried, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, and he felt his own eyes sting with emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. I am sorry, Penelope gasped when she finally got herself under control, pulling back and wiping at her eyes with her apron. I did not mean to fall apart like that. You must think I am terribly weak. I think you are one of the strongest people I have ever met, Thomas said honestly, using his thumb to brush away a tear she had missed. And I think you have been holding yourself together through sheer force of will for a very long time. There is no shame in letting someone else be strong for you once in a while. Penelope looked up at him, and in the starlight, her eyes were dark and luminous. Why are you doing this, Thomas? Really? It cannot just be because you need a housekeeper. You could have hired someone from town and avoided all this complication. Why did you choose me, and why are you offering to pay off debts that are not your responsibility? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that the answer to her question was going to change things between them in ways he was not entirely prepared for. But he had spent 10 years being a coward, hiding from life and connection, and Penelope was right that it was time to stop wasting time. Because from the moment I saw you standing outside that boarding house, chin up and shoulders back despite the fact that your world was falling apart, I saw something in you that called to something in me. I saw someone who was broken but not defeated, someone who still had fight left despite having every reason to give up. And I thought, maybe if I help her, maybe if I give her a chance to rebuild, maybe I will remember how to do the same thing for myself. Maybe if I do something brave like reaching out to a stranger, maybe I will remember how to be alive instead of just surviving. And has it worked? Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Have you remembered? I am starting to, Thomas admitted. You make me want to be the man I was before everything fell apart. You make me think about the future instead of just dwelling in the past. And I am not saying this to make you uncomfortable or to suggest that there is any expectation attached to my offer to help you. I am just being honest about why I care whether or not you are free of your debts. It is not just kindness to a stranger. It is caring about someone who has become important to me in a very short time. Penelope searched his face for a long moment, and Thomas held still under her scrutiny, letting her see whatever she needed to see. Finally, she nodded slowly. I accept your offer, she said quietly, but only if you let me pay you back, even if it takes me years. I will not be a charity case, Thomas, not even for someone who has been as kind to me as you have been. I will work for you, and I will pay my own way, and I will repay every cent of what you lend me. Is that acceptable? It is acceptable, Thomas agreed, relief flooding through him. I will ride into Challis tomorrow and arrange for a bank draft to be sent to your creditors. If you give me the names and addresses tonight, I can have it taken care of within the week. And Penelope, thank you for accepting my help. I know it was not easy for you. Thank you for offering it, Penelope said softly. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. You have given me back my life, Thomas Rourke. I do not know how I will ever repay that, but I promise I will spend every day trying. They stood on the porch holding hands and watching the stars for a long time, neither of them wanting to break the moment by going inside. Something had shifted between them tonight. Some barrier had come down, and they both knew that their relationship had moved beyond employer and employee into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. Neither of them spoke about it, but the awareness was there in the way Thomas's thumb traced small circles on the back of Penelope's hand, and in the way Penelope leaned slightly closer to him as the night air grew cold. The next morning, Thomas rode into Challis with a list of Penelope's creditors and instructions to his banker to arrange payment in full for all debts owed. The banker, a shrewd man named Howard who had known Thomas since childhood, raised his eyebrows at the request, but asked no questions beyond confirming the amounts and addresses. By the time Thomas rode back to the ranch that afternoon, $718 had been dispersed across the country to pay off the debts of a woman he had known for less than a month, and Thomas felt lighter than he had in a decade. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Thomas could remember since Mary's death. Penelope bloomed under the security of knowing she was free from debt, and her natural warmth and humor emerged more fully as the weight of worry lifted from her shoulders. She sang while she worked, hummed while she cooked, and filled the house with a joy that was infectious. The ranch hands responded to her with a combination of respect and affection, and even the gruff Jack could be seen smiling at her jokes during meals. Thomas found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to hear her laugh, to see her face light up when she talked about plans for the garden or improvements to the house. They fell into an easy companionship that blurred the lines between friendship and something deeper. Thomas taught Penelope to ride the gentle mare he had bought from a neighbor, and they took to going on evening rides through the valley when the work was done. Penelope taught Thomas how to cook dishes more complicated than beans and bacon, and they spent long hours in the kitchen together, talking about everything and nothing while the bread rose and the stew simmered. They played cards in the evenings, read books aloud to each other, and spent hours on the porch watching the stars and sharing stories about their lives. The first snow came in early November, transforming the valley into a wonderland of white. Thomas came in from checking on the cattle to find Penelope standing at the kitchen window with a look of pure delight on her face, watching the fat flakes drift down from a gray sky. Without thinking, he walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him with a sigh of contentment, and they stood like that for a long time, watching the snow fall and letting themselves be happy. "I love it here," Penelope said softly, her hands coming up to rest on his arms. "I never thought I would say that about anywhere after leaving Kansas City, but this place feels like home in a way that nowhere else ever has." "I am glad," Thomas murmured against her hair, breathing in the scent of her that was becoming as familiar and necessary as the air he breathed. "I want you to be happy here, Penelope. I want you to feel like this is where you belong." She turned in his arms to face him, and Thomas saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "I know it is too soon, and I know we have both been hurt badly, and I know that this could complicate everything. But I cannot keep pretending that what I feel for you is just gratitude or friendship. It is more than that, Thomas, so much more." Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I am already in love with you," he confessed. "I think I have been since the day I first saw you in town, standing up to your circumstances with such courage. You have brought light back into my life, Penelope. You have given me a reason to believe in the future again. I know we both carry scars from the past, but maybe we can help each other heal. Maybe we can build something new together, something that honors what we have lost while still letting us move forward." "I would like that," Penelope whispered, and then she rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them afraid of moving too fast or feeling too much, but it quickly deepened into something that held all the longing and hope and need that they had been holding back. Thomas pulled her closer, memorizing the feel of her in his arms, and Penelope wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him like he was the answer to every prayer she had ever whispered. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard and grinning like fools. "We should probably talk about what this means," Thomas said, his forehead resting against hers, "about where we go from here and what we both want." "I want you," Penelope said simply. "I want a life with you, a future with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing that I get to spend another day by your side. I want to build something real and lasting, the way your wife wanted to build something here before her life was cut short. I know I cannot replace her, and I would never try to, but I can love you in my own way and try to make you as happy as you have made me." "You could never replace Mary, but you do not have to," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "What I feel for you is not the same as what I felt for her, but it is just as real and just as strong. You are not a substitute or a second choice. You are exactly who I need exactly when I need you, and I want everything you just described. I want to marry you, Penelope, if you will have me. I want to make this arrangement permanent and build a life together that honors both our pasts while creating a future that is entirely our own." Penelope's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling so brightly that Thomas felt like he was looking at the sun. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Thomas Rourke, I will marry you. I will marry you and love you and stand by your side for as long as we both shall live." Thomas kissed her again, pouring 10 years of loneliness and loss and longing into the kiss, and Penelope met him with equal intensity. They held each other in the kitchen while the snow fell outside and the bread rose on the counter. two broken people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and were brave enough to believe in second chances. They were married in Challis on a cold December morning, in the small church at the edge of town, with the ranch hands serving as witnesses and half the town in attendance out of curiosity. Penelope wore a simple dress of deep blue wool that Thomas had insisted on buying for her, despite her protests that her old black dress was perfectly serviceable. Thomas wore his best suit, the one he had not put on since Mary's funeral, and he did not feel guilty about that at all. This was a new beginning, and it deserved to be marked with joy rather than sorrow. The ceremony was short and sweet, with a pastor who had known Thomas his entire life and who seemed genuinely delighted to see him finding happiness again. When Thomas slipped the plain gold band onto Penelope's finger, he felt something in his chest click into place, like a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for far too long. Penelope looked up at him with such love and trust in her eyes that he had to blink back tears, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with all the reverence and passion he possessed. They held a small reception at the ranch that evening, with food that Penelope had prepared in advance and music provided by Jack, who turned out to have a surprisingly good voice and a way with a fiddle. The men toasted the happy couple, and Thomas gave a short speech thanking them all for their loyalty and hard work. When the festivities finally wound down and the last guest departed, Thomas and Penelope were alone in the house that had become theirs together. Thomas carried Penelope up the stairs to the master bedroom, the room he had not shared with anyone since Mary's death. Penelope had cleaned it and aired it out weeks ago, had put fresh linens on the bed and hung new curtains at the windows, transforming it from a shrine to a space that could be theirs together. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands, suddenly feeling nervous despite the fact that they had already declared their love for each other. "If you need time," he said softly, "if this is too much too soon, we can wait. I do not want you to feel pressured into anything just because we are married now." Penelope smiled and reached up to loosen his tie, her fingers steady and sure. "I do not need time, Thomas. I need you. I have needed you since the moment you offered me hope when I had none. Make love to me, husband. Help me start this new chapter of our lives the way it should begin, with trust and love and the promise of many years together." Thomas needed no further encouragement. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, taking his time to show her with actions what words could not adequately express. They undressed each other with a combination of nervousness and desire, discovering each other's bodies with gentle hands and murmured endearments. When Thomas finally joined with Penelope, it felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding the missing piece of himself that he had thought was lost forever. They moved together with a natural rhythm, building to a crescendo that left them both breathless and clinging to each other in the aftermath. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, Penelope's head resting on Thomas's chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her. The house creaked and settled around them, and outside the winter wind howled, but they were warm and safe and complete. "I love you, Penelope Rourke," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy who did not know how much he needed saving." "I love you too, Thomas Rourke," Penelope murmured, already half asleep. "Thank you for seeing past the debt and the fear to the hope I brought with me. Thank you for shouldering my burdens so I could walk into the future with my head held high." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, two people who had been broken by loss and remade by love, ready to face whatever the future held together. The winter passed in a blur of domestic happiness. Thomas and Penelope settled into married life with an ease that suggested they had been together for years rather than months. Penelope continued to run the household with cheerful efficiency, but now she did so as the lady of the house rather than the hired help, and the difference was profound. She made decisions about improvements and purchases without needing to consult Thomas for approval, and she poured her energy into transforming the double R into a home that reflected both of them, rather than just Thomas's memories of the past. Thomas, for his part, blossomed under Penelope's love and attention. The lines of grief and loneliness that had been carved into his face began to soften, and he smiled more in 3 months than he had in the previous 10 years combined. He taught Penelope everything he knew about ranching, and she proved to be a quick study, riding out with him to check on the cattle and learning to rope and brand and doctor sick animals. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, building a partnership that was equal parts passion and practicality. In early March, Penelope missed her monthly courses and felt the familiar nausea that she had heard other women describe but had never experienced herself. She waited another week to be sure before telling Thomas, afraid to hope after so many years of disappointment with Robert. When she finally gathered her courage and shared the news over breakfast one morning, Thomas went absolutely still, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Penelope, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor confirming it," Penelope said, watching his face carefully and trying to gauge his reaction. "I know we have not talked about children, and I know you lost your first child. If you need time to process this, I understand. I am nervous too." Thomas set down his coffee cup very carefully and then stood up and walked around the table to pull Penelope into his arms. She could feel him shaking, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I am terrified," he admitted. "I am absolutely terrified that something will go wrong, that I will lose you the way I lost Mary, that history will repeat itself. But I am also more happy than I can express. A baby, Penelope, our baby. A second chance at the family I thought I would never have. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to give me this gift." Penelope held him tight, blinking back tears of relief and joy. "We will get through this together," she promised. "I will take every precaution and we will make sure I have the best care available. But Thomas, I need you to believe that I am going to be fine, that we are both going to be fine. I cannot carry your fear along with this baby. Do you understand?" Thomas pulled back and looked into her eyes, and she saw him make a conscious decision to choose hope over fear. "You are right," he said, taking a deep breath. "I cannot let the past steal the joy of this present. I will believe that you and the baby will be healthy and that we will get to watch our child grow up together. I will choose to have faith instead of fear." "That is all I ask," Penelope said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "Now we need to discuss practical matters. I want to have a doctor from Boise come stay at the ranch for the last month of my pregnancy. I know it will be expensive, but I think the peace of mind will be worth every penny." "Whatever you need," Thomas agreed immediately. "Money is not an issue when it comes to keeping you and the baby safe. We will hire the best doctor we can find, and we will make sure you have everything you need to have a healthy pregnancy and delivery." True to his word, Thomas spared no expense in ensuring Penelope's health and safety throughout her pregnancy. He hired a doctor from Boise named Samuel Foster, who agreed to come stay at the ranch for the final 6 weeks before the baby was due. He ordered books on pregnancy and childbirth, and read them cover to cover, taking notes on what to expect and how to help. He insisted that Penelope rest more and work less, though she laughed at his overprotectiveness, and continued doing most of her usual tasks until the final weeks when her growing belly made it genuinely difficult to move around. The ranch hands treated Penelope like precious china, jumping to help her with anything heavy and scolding her gently when she tried to do too much. Jack appointed himself her personal guardian, following her around like a concerned sheepdog and muttering about stubborn women who did not have the sense God gave a goose. Penelope bore all the attention with amused patience, understanding that their protectiveness came from genuine affection and concern. As summer bloomed across the valley, Penelope bloomed along with it. Her body changed and expanded to accommodate the growing life within her, and Thomas found her more beautiful than ever. He would sit for hours with his hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick and move, marveling at the miracle of new life. They talked endlessly about names and nursery arrangements and what kind of parents they wanted to be. They agreed that they would raise their child to be strong and kind, to value honesty and hard work, to appreciate the beauty of the wild places they called home. Dr. Foster arrived in late September, a kind older man with gentle hands and a calm demeanor that immediately put both Thomas and Penelope at ease. He examined Penelope thoroughly and pronounced her healthy and strong, with no signs of any problems. The baby was positioned correctly and seemed to be thriving. Everything looked perfect for a normal delivery, he assured them, though he cautioned that childbirth always carried risks, and they should be prepared for any eventuality. Thomas tried not to let fear take hold, but as Penelope's due date approached, he found himself struggling with memories of Mary's death. He had nightmares about losing Penelope, woke up in cold sweats reaching for her to make sure she was still breathing beside him. Penelope understood his fear and did her best to reassure him, but there was only so much she could do. The rest was up to Thomas and his own ability to choose faith over fear. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly a year after Penelope had first arrived in Challis, she felt the first contractions. She was in the kitchen preparing supper when the pain hit, sharp and unmistakable, and she had to grip the counter to keep from doubling over. Thomas was in the barn, and she sent young Billy running to fetch him while she made her way slowly up the stairs to the bedroom where Dr. Foster was already waiting, alerted by some sixth sense that the time had come. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Thomas stayed by Penelope's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when she was certain she could not endure another moment. Dr. Foster was patient and skilled, guiding Penelope through each stage of labor with calm instructions and gentle support. And Penelope herself was a warrior, refusing to give up even when the pain became nearly unbearable, determined to bring their child safely into the world. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith on that October afternoon, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being evicted from his warm, comfortable home, and Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. Dr. Foster cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him carefully in Penelope's arms. "You have a healthy son," the doctor said with a warm smile. 10 fingers, 10 toes, good strong lungs, and a fine head of dark hair. Congratulations to you both. Thomas sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at his wife and child with wonder. Penelope looked exhausted but radiant, her face glowing with a joy that transcended the physical ordeal she had just endured. The baby had quieted and was looking around with unfocused eyes, already searching for the source of his mother's voice. "Hello, little one," Penelope whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world. Your father and I have been waiting so long to meet you." "He is perfect," Thomas said hoarsely, reaching out with one finger to touch his son's impossibly tiny hand. The baby immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength, and Thomas felt his heart crack wide open with love so intense it was almost painful. "Penelope, you did it. You brought him here safely. Thank you. Thank you for being so strong, for giving me this gift, for making me a father." "We did it together," Penelope corrected gently, shifting the baby so Thomas could see him better. "What should we name him?" "We had so many options, but now that he is here, I think we should choose something that feels right for him specifically." Thomas studied his son's face, memorizing every detail. The baby had Penelope's dark hair and what looked like it might be Thomas's gray eyes, though it was too early to tell for certain. He was beautiful and perfect, and entirely his own person, not a replacement for the child Thomas had lost, but a new beginning, a fresh start. "What about Samuel?" Thomas suggested. "After Dr. Foster, who made sure both of you came through this safely, Samuel Rourke, it has a good, strong sound to it." "Samuel," Penelope repeated, testing the name. She looked down at her son and smiled. "Yes, I think that is exactly right. Samuel Thomas Rourke, named for the men who will teach him how to be good and strong and kind." Dr. Foster, who had been discreetly checking on Penelope and cleaning up from the delivery, looked up with surprise and pleasure. "You would name your son after me. I am honored beyond words, truly." "You helped bring him safely into the world," Thomas said, standing to shake the doctor's hand firmly. "That deserves to be recognized and remembered. We are grateful for your skill and your care, Dr. Foster. You have given us the greatest gift imaginable." The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Samuel proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who demanded attention at all hours and rewarded his parents with moments of such pure sweetness that they forgave him instantly for any inconvenience. Thomas was a devoted father from the first moment, changing diapers and walking the floor with Samuel when he was fussy, singing off key lullabies that somehow soothed the baby when nothing else would. Penelope recovered quickly from the delivery and settled into motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else, though she was much more patient with herself about the learning curve than she had been about housekeeping. The ranch hands fell in love with baby Samuel, taking turns visiting the house to peer at him and offer gruff congratulations. Jack whittled a set of wooden toys for the baby and presented them to Penelope with an embarrassed grumble about having nothing better to do with his evenings. The youngest ranch hand, Billy, appointed himself Samuel's protector and could often be found sitting outside the house during his breaks, keeping watch like a faithful dog. As winter closed in again and the first anniversary of their marriage approached, Thomas and Penelope took stock of how much their lives had changed in such a short time. They were no longer two lonely, grieving people trying to survive their losses. They were a family, bound together by love and commitment, and the shared purpose of raising their son to be a good man. The debts that had once seemed so crushing were long paid off, and in their place was the wealth of a life filled with meaning and connection. On a snowy December evening, they sat together in the parlor with Samuel asleep in Penelope's arms. The fire crackled cheerfully in the fireplace, and the house was warm and bright with the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you are meant to be. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Penelope asked softly, not wanting to wake the baby. "When I told you about my debts and you offered me the job anyway." "I remember," Thomas said, smiling at the memory. "I said I would shoulder the debt if you would bring hope. I thought I was being generous, offering to take on your burdens. But the truth is you gave me far more than I gave you. You brought hope back into my life when I had forgotten what it felt like. You gave me a reason to believe in the future. You made me want to be alive again instead of just going through the motions." "We saved each other," Penelope said simply. That is what love does, I think. It sees past the surface to the person underneath, and it offers grace instead of judgment. You saw me at my lowest point and offered me dignity and opportunity. I saw you locked in grief and offered you the possibility of joy again. We were both brave enough to take the chances offered to us, and look what we have built as a result. Thomas leaned over to kiss her gently, careful not to disturb Samuel. I love you, Penelope Rourke. Thank you for bringing hope into my life. Thank you for giving me a family again. Thank you for being exactly who you are. I love you too, Thomas Rourke, Penelope whispered back. Thank you for shouldering my burdens when I could not carry them alone. Thank you for seeing the woman I could be instead of just the desperate widow I was. Thank you for choosing to believe in us even when it would have been easier to stay safe and alone. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their son sleep and counting their blessings. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in white and promising a fresh start with each new flake. Inside, the house that had once been a tomb was now filled with life and laughter and love. Two broken people had found each other at exactly the right moment and had been brave enough to build something beautiful from the pieces of their shattered lives. The years that followed were good ones for the Rourke family. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who kept his parents on their toes with his endless questions and adventurous spirit. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, perched in front of his father on the saddle, and he followed Thomas around the ranch like a devoted shadow, absorbing everything he could about ranching and cattle and the land they called home. 2 years after Samuel was born, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Ann, called Maggie from the start. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she was as sweet-tempered as her brother was rambunctious. Samuel took his role as big brother seriously, appointing himself Maggie's protector and entertaining her with stories and songs when she was fussy. 3 years after Maggie, twin boys arrived, Andrew and William, who immediately doubled the chaos and joy in the Rourke household. Thomas built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, and Penelope somehow managed to keep everyone fed and clothed and loved, despite the demands of 4 young children. The ranch hands pitched in to help, becoming unofficial uncles to the Rourke children and teaching them skills their father did not have time to cover. Through it all, Thomas and Penelope's love for each other only deepened and grew stronger. They still made time for evening rides through the valley when they could arrange childcare, still sat on the porch watching stars after the children were in bed, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They weathered the challenges that came with raising a family and running a ranch, supporting each other through difficult times and celebrating together during good ones. The Double R Ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the valley. Thomas's skill with cattle and Penelope's business acumen made them a formidable team, and they earned a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. They employed more ranch hands as the operation grew, and they treated their workers with the same respect and dignity that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. As the children grew older, Thomas and Penelope made sure to tell them the story of how their parents had met, how a desperate widow and a lonely cowboy had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and had chosen to build a life together based on trust and love. They wanted their children to understand that family is not just about blood, but about the choices we make to stand by each other, to shoulder each other's burdens, and to offer hope when hope seems impossible. Samuel, as the eldest, particularly loved hearing about how his mother had arrived in Challis with nothing but debts and determination, and how his father had seen past the surface circumstances to the strength and character underneath. "You were both brave," he would say seriously, already showing signs of the thoughtful man he would become. "You could have given up, but you did not. You chose to believe in something better, even when it was scary." "That is the most important lesson we can teach you," Thomas would reply, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "Life will knock you down sometimes. It will take away things you love and leave you feeling like you cannot go on. But if you can find even a small spark of hope to hold on to, if you can find people who believe in you and support you, you can rebuild anything. Your mother taught me that, and I hope we can teach it to all of you." As the years turned into decades, Thomas and Penelope watched their children grow into capable, kind adults who carried forward the values they had been taught. Samuel took over management of the ranch when Thomas was ready to step back, bringing new ideas and energy while respecting the traditions his parents had established. Maggie married a neighboring rancher and established her own successful horse breeding operation. The twins went into business together, opening a store in Challis that quickly became a cornerstone of the community. Thomas and Penelope became grandparents many times over, and their house was always filled with the sound of children's laughter as grandchildren came to visit and hear stories about the old days. They grew old together with grace and humor, their hair turning gray and their faces becoming lined with age, but their love for each other remaining as strong and vital as it had been that snowy night when Thomas had first kissed his bride. On a warm spring evening in 1918, 40 years after they had first met, Thomas and Penelope sat on the porch of the Double R Ranch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. They were in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and spirit. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the valley, building their own lives while remaining connected to the family ranch that was the heart of their world. "Did you ever imagine this?" Penelope asked softly, her hand clasped in Thomas's the way it had been for 40 years. "When you saw me step off that wagon in Challis, did you ever imagine that we would build all of this together?" "I imagined hope," Thomas said thoughtfully, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "I saw a woman who refused to be defeated by her circumstances, and I imagined that maybe helping her would help me too. But this, a lifetime of love and partnership and family, this exceeded my wildest dreams, Penelope. You exceeded them. Every single day for 40 years, you have been more than I deserved and exactly what I needed." "We deserved each other," Penelope corrected gently. "Two broken people who were brave enough to believe in second chances. That is what we were, and that is what we gave each other. Not just a second chance at happiness, but a whole lifetime of chances, of choosing each other over and over again through good times and difficult ones. I would not change a single moment of our life together, Thomas. Not one." "Nor would I," Thomas agreed, pulling her closer and wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You brought hope into my life when I had none, Penelope Rourke. You brought light into darkness and life into death. You taught me that it is never too late to start over, never too late to choose joy over sorrow. You were the best decision I ever made, and I thank God every day that I was brave enough to speak to you that October afternoon in Challis. And I thank God every day that I was desperate enough to accept help from a stranger," Penelope said with a smile. "Because that stranger became my husband, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. We shouldered each other's burdens and gave each other hope, and we built something beautiful from the ruins of our old lives. That is what love does, Thomas. It transforms and redeems and makes all things new." They sat together in the gathering dusk, two elderly people who had lived a remarkable love story, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love well nurtured. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous, and thriving under their children's care. The house behind them was filled with memories of laughter and tears, of ordinary days and extraordinary moments, of a family built on a foundation of trust and commitment. And in their clasped hands was the promise they had made to each other 40 years earlier, a promise to shoulder each other's burdens and to bring hope into each other's lives no matter what challenges they faced. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to emerge one by one, Thomas and Penelope Rourke gave thanks for the unlikely miracle of their meeting, for the grace that had brought them together, and for the 40 years of love that had followed. They had started with nothing but debts and loneliness and grief, but they had ended with everything that truly mattered: family, purpose, connection, and a love that had stood the test of time. The widow had confessed she brought only debt. The lonely cowboy had said he would shoulder it. And together, they had discovered that hope was more than enough to build a lifetime upon. Their story was proof that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to accept help when it is offered, to extend help when it is needed, and to believe that even in our darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light and love and new beginnings.